What if I told you that the most famous meal in human history wasn't about food at all? That when Jesus fed 5,000 people with just 5 loaves and 2 fish, something far more extraordinary than multiplication happened. Something that modern psychology can finally explain, but that most people completely miss. Today, we're diving into 3 hidden psychological secrets behind this miracle that will change how you see mass human behavior forever. The truth isn't what you think. Here's what most people don't understand about the feeding of the 5,000. It wasn't just about hungry people getting food. Look at the setup. You have thousands of people gathered in a remote location following a charismatic leader. They've been listening for hours, completely absorbed. Then suddenly there's a crisis. No food, nowhere to go, panic setting in. But here's where it gets strange. According to every historical account, when the distribution began, something unprecedented happened. Not chaos, not pushing, not the mob mentality you'd expect. Instead, perfect order. People sitting in groups of 50, waiting patiently, sharing peacefully. 5,000 hungry people, and not a single recorded incident of fighting or disorder. Think about this for a moment. When have you ever seen large crowds behave this way? Modern crowd psychology tells us that groups over 1,000 people almost always experience what we call de-individuation. People lose their individual identity and rational thinking. We see it at concerts, sporting events, even in shopping malls during sales. But somehow, this crowd of 5,000 hungry people displayed the opposite behavior. The traditional explanation focuses on the food multiplication. But what if we're missing the real miracle? What if the extraordinary thing wasn't what happened to the bread and fish, but what happened to the people themselves? Modern neuroscience has discovered something fascinating about group consciousness that might explain this impossible crowd behavior. When large groups synchronize their attention on a single focal point, like thousands of people focused on one speaker, something remarkable happens in their brains. Mirror neurons begin firing in unison, creating what researchers call neural synchrony. But this wasn't just any speaker. This was someone who had already demonstrated an unprecedented ability to influence human behavior through presence alone. Here's what modern psychology reveals about that day. Jesus had accidentally created the perfect conditions for what scientists now call collective flow state. This is a rare phenomenon where large groups enter a synchronized psychological state that dramatically alters behavior, perception, and even physiological responses. Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who discovered flow states, found that when groups achieve collective flow, individual consciousness temporarily merges with group consciousness. People report experiencing expanded awareness, heightened intuition, and what feels like access to collective intelligence. But here's the crucial part. In collective flow, individual needs become secondary to the group's well-being. Now look at the historical details with this lens. The crowd had been with Jesus for 3 days. 3 days of synchronized attention, shared emotional experiences, collective singing, and unified focus. Their brains were already primed for synchrony. When the food crisis emerged, instead of triggering panic, it became what psychologists call a peak challenge, the exact type of obstacle that can push a synchronized group into an even deeper flow state. But there's something even more extraordinary. Recent studies on collective flow have documented cases where groups experience what researchers carefully term non-ordinary phenomena. Shared visions, synchronized insights, even reports of physical sensations that seem to transcend individual biology. Dr. David Pearl's research on group consciousness found that in peak collective states, groups can access problem-solving abilities that seem to exceed the sum of individual capabilities. Consider this. What if the multiplication wasn't just about bread and fish? What if it was about the multiplication of human generosity, empathy, and collective intelligence? Archaeological evidence suggests that in first-century Palestine, travelers commonly carried hidden emergency rations. What if the real miracle was psychological, a collective transformation so profound that thousands of people simultaneously overcame their survival instincts and shared their secret provisions? This would explain the perfect order, the lack of conflict, and yes, even the abundance of food. Not through supernatural multiplication, but through something equally extraordinary: the complete transformation of human nature from scarcity-based thinking to abundance-based sharing. Modern psychology has documented this exact phenomenon in disaster situations where communities enter collective flow states. Think of it like this. Have you ever been in a concert where 50,000 people are singing the same song, moving to the same beat, completely lost in the moment? For those few minutes, you're not just yourself anymore. You're part of something bigger. Your individual consciousness merges with the crowd's consciousness. Now imagine that feeling, but instead of lasting for one song, it lasts for 3 days. Instead of just singing, you're sharing the deepest questions about life, meaning, and human potential. And instead of a rock star on stage, you have someone whose very presence seems to dissolve the barriers between people. The bread miracle is like the ultimate crowd surfing experience. When you crowd surf, you literally trust thousands of strangers to support you. You let go of individual control and surrender to collective care. But what happened with the 5,000 was crowd surfing for the soul. People didn't just trust the crowd with their bodies, they trusted the group with their survival, their resources, their deepest fears about scarcity. Here's what's mind-blowing. Modern neuroscience shows that in peak collective experiences, the part of the brain responsible for self-preservation actually goes quiet. The default mode network, what scientists call our selfish brain, temporarily shuts down. When this happens to entire groups simultaneously, behaviors that seem impossible become natural. Those 5,000 people experienced what we might call psychological multiplication. Individual empathy multiplied into collective compassion. Personal generosity multiplied into group abundance. Private faith multiplied into shared courage. The bread and fish were just the visible symbol of an invisible transformation happening at the deepest level of human consciousness. This is why the story has survived 2,000 years. Not just because bread appeared, but because it proved something we desperately need to remember. Under the right conditions, human beings can transcend their individual limitations and access collective capabilities that seem miraculous. If this is exploding your head, leave your like so more people can discover these hidden truths. But wait, because the second case is even more shocking. Now here's where the story gets even stranger. Most people focus on what Jesus did, but they completely miss what he didn't do. And what he didn't do reveals a leadership strategy so counterintuitive that it breaks every rule in the book. When the crisis hit, 5,000 hungry people, no food approaching nightfall, his disciples came to him with the obvious solution: send the crowds away so they can buy food in the villages. This is classic crisis management 101. Disperse the problem, transfer responsibility, minimize risk. Any rational leader would have agreed. But Jesus did the opposite. Not only did he refuse to send them away, he told his disciples something that makes no logical sense. You give them something to eat. Think about this command. 12 men, 5,000 people. He essentially told them to solve an impossible problem with resources they didn't have. Here's what's psychologically fascinating. This wasn't leadership, it was anti-leadership. Traditional leadership is about having answers, showing strength, maintaining control. But in this moment, Jesus demonstrated what modern psychology calls vulnerable leadership, admitting limitation while simultaneously refusing to abandon responsibility. Dr. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability in leadership has revealed something counterintuitive. Leaders who acknowledge their limitations while maintaining commitment to their people actually increase trust and group cohesion. But this goes even further. By saying you feed them, Jesus was practicing what organizational psychologists call distributed leadership, spreading responsibility across the entire group rather than centralizing it. But here's the part that breaks all leadership models. He then took the position of lowest status. While his disciples organized the crowd, he took the role of a servant, blessing and breaking bread. The leader became the waiter. In a hierarchical society where status meant everything, this was psychological dynamite. Modern studies on status reversal in groups show that when high-status individuals voluntarily take low-status roles, it creates what researchers call psychological safety throughout the entire group. People feel permission to be vulnerable, to share resources, to take risks they normally wouldn't take. What Jesus demonstrated that day was what modern organizational psychology calls paradoxical leadership, a style so counterintuitive that it seems to violate basic human nature, yet produces results that traditional leadership cannot achieve. Dr. Marianne Lewis's research on paradoxical leadership identifies several key behaviors that create extraordinary group performance. First, leaders embrace contradictions rather than resolving them. Instead of choosing between feeding the crowd or sending them away, Jesus held both the impossibility of the situation and the responsibility to solve it simultaneously. Second, paradoxical leaders practice both-and thinking instead of either-or thinking. Jesus didn't choose between divine power and human limitation. He operated from both simultaneously. He took full responsibility while acknowledging complete inadequacy. This creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance in followers, forcing their brains to find creative solutions. But here's the breakthrough insight. Recent neuroscience research has discovered that cognitive dissonance, when experienced in safe group settings, actually enhances creative problem-solving abilities. Dr. David Rock's studies show that when our brains can't resolve contradictions through normal logic, they shift into what he calls insight mode, a state where solutions appear seemingly from nowhere. This explains why the disciples went from impossible to action so quickly. The psychological tension created by Jesus's paradoxical command, "Feed them with what you don't have," forced their brains into insight mode. Suddenly, they noticed resources they had overlooked. The boys' small lunch, the possibilities for organization, the potential for creative distribution. But there's an even deeper principle at work. Dr. Otto Scharmer's research on presencing, leadership from emerging future possibilities rather than past patterns, shows that when leaders hold space for solutions that don't yet exist, groups can access collective intelligence that transcends individual thinking. Jesus wasn't just solving a logistics problem, he was modeling a completely different way of approaching impossible challenges. Instead of managing scarcity, he was creating abundance consciousness. Instead of reducing the problem, he was expanding the group's capacity to hold paradox. This is why the miracle wasn't just about food. It was about leadership that transforms how groups think about possibility itself. Modern change management studies show that the biggest barrier to innovation isn't lack of resources, it's mental models that define what's possible. Jesus shattered those mental models in real time. Imagine you're playing a video game where you're the team leader and suddenly your entire team is trapped in an impossible level. Traditional leadership says, let's retreat and find an easier path. But paradoxical leadership says, let's stay in this impossible situation and discover capabilities we didn't know we had. It's like being a conductor of an orchestra that has never played together, with sheet music for a symphony that hasn't been written yet in front of an audience of 5,000 people. Instead of cancelling the concert, you raise your baton and trust that the music will emerge from the collective creativity of the moment. This is exactly what Jesus did. He became a conductor of human potential rather than a manager of human limitations. When you conduct an orchestra, you don't play any instruments yourself. You create conditions where others can access their highest capabilities. You hold space for harmony that doesn't yet exist. Here's what's revolutionary. Most leaders try to solve problems by adding resources. But paradoxical leaders solve problems by changing the group's relationship to the problem itself. They don't ask, how can we get more? They ask, how can we become more? When Jesus said, you feed them, he wasn't giving the disciples a task. He was giving them an identity upgrade. He was saying, you are the kind of people who can create abundance where there appears to be scarcity. This is what psychologists call identity-based motivation, the most powerful form of human motivation that exists. The multiplication miracle becomes a metaphor for leadership that multiplies human capacity instead of just managing human resources. Each loaf that was broken and shared represented the breaking open of limited thinking. Each fish that fed multitudes represented the expansion of what groups believe is possible when they operate from abundance consciousness rather than scarcity fear. This is why great leaders throughout history have used similar paradoxical strategies. They create impossible situations that force groups to discover capabilities they never knew they had. They conduct symphonies of human potential rather than managing orchestras of human limitation. And subscribe now, because the third case that comes next will completely change your perspective on human nature. Here's the most mind-bending aspect of the entire event. What happened after the food ran out is more impossible than the feeding itself. According to historical accounts, when the meal was finished, the disciples collected 12 baskets of leftover fragments, 12 baskets from 5 loaves and 2 fish. But here's what makes no psychological sense. In a crowd of 5,000 hungry people who had just experienced what they believed was a miracle, why was there any food left at all? Think about human behavior in miracle situations. When people witness what they believe is supernatural abundance, they typically hoard, collect souvenirs, or consume everything available. Yet somehow not only was there food remaining, but it was organized into exactly 12 baskets, one for each disciple. This suggests a level of collective coordination and restraint that defies everything we know about crowd psychology during extraordinary events. Dr. Maurice Halbwachs, who pioneered the study of collective memory, discovered that groups don't just remember events. They actively reshape them in ways that serve the group's ongoing identity and purpose. But what happened that day was the opposite. The experience was so transformative that it reshaped the people. Here's the deeper mystery. Every person in that crowd carried this story for the rest of their lives. In a pre-literate society where most events were forgotten within weeks, this single experience became a foundational memory that was passed down through generations with remarkable consistency. Modern neuroscience explains why certain experiences create flashbulb memories, vivid, detailed recollections that remain unchanged for decades. These typically involve high emotional intensity combined with personal significance. But the bread miracle created something even rarer. Collective flashbulb memory, where thousands of people shared virtually identical recollections of the same event. Dr. Diana Tamir's research on social memory shows that when groups share profound experiences, their individual memory systems begin to function more like a collective memory network. People don't just remember their own experience, they remember the group's experience as if it were their own. But here's what's unprecedented. The leftover fragments became physical anchors for this collective memory. 12 baskets distributed among 12 disciples who would carry them to 12 different regions, creating 12 centers of shared remembrance. What modern psychology reveals about those 12 baskets will shatter your understanding of human memory and collective consciousness. Those fragments weren't just leftover food, they were what Dr. Jan Assmann calls cultural memory objects, physical items that carry the DNA of transformative group experiences across time and space. Recent research in collective memory formation shows that when groups experience what they perceive as miraculous events, they unconsciously create what psychologists call memory anchors, physical or symbolic objects that preserve not just the facts of the experience, but its emotional and spiritual impact. But here's the extraordinary part. Dr. Merlin Donald's research on hybrid thinking, how humans use external objects to extend their cognitive abilities, reveals that these memory anchors don't just store memories, they actively recreate the psychological states associated with the original experience. When those disciples carried their baskets to different communities, they weren't just sharing a story, they were spreading a psychological contagion. Each fragment carried what Dr. Robert Sapolsky calls embodied memory, the physical capacity to trigger the same neurological states that occurred during the original event. This explains something that has puzzled historians for 2,000 years. How a single event in a remote location spread across the entire Mediterranean world within decades, creating identical behavioral changes in completely different cultures. It wasn't just the story that spread, it was the actual psychological transformation. Modern studies on emotional contagion show that when people handle objects that were present during peak emotional experiences, their nervous systems can actually synchronize with the emotional states of the original experience. Dr. Elaine Hatfield's research demonstrates that this effect can spread through social networks, creating waves of behavioral change that appear to operate independently of conscious communication. Those 12 baskets became the world's first viral technology, not for spreading information, but for spreading transformation itself. Each fragment was like a seed, carrying the complete psychological DNA of the abundance experience, capable of regenerating similar states in new people and new communities. This is why the bread miracle became foundational to Western civilization in ways that pure philosophy or theology never could. It created what Dr. Victor Turner calls communitas, a state of social bonding that transcends normal cultural boundaries, and then embedded that state in physical objects that could regenerate the experience across generations. The fragments prove that the real miracle wasn't multiplication of food, but multiplication of consciousness, the capacity to experience abundance, generosity, and collective care as fundamental human possibilities rather than impossible ideals. Picture this. You know how a song can instantly transport you back to a specific moment in your life? How hearing just a few notes can make you feel exactly the way you felt years ago, complete with the same emotions, the same energy, even the same physical sensations. The 12 baskets worked like that, but for an entire civilization. Each fragment was like a compressed file containing the complete experience of that day. Not just the memory of what happened, but the actual feeling of living in a world where abundance is possible, where strangers become family, where impossible problems find unexpected solutions. When those disciples traveled with their baskets, they were carrying spiritual USB drives. Each time someone touched a fragment, heard the story, or broke bread in remembrance, their nervous system downloaded the original experience. They didn't just learn about the miracle, they felt what it was like to live inside it. This is like the ultimate peer-to-peer network for consciousness transformation. Instead of sharing files, they were sharing states of being. Instead of downloading information, people were downloading ways of experiencing reality, where scarcity thinking gets replaced by abundance awareness. Here's what's mind-blowing about this ancient technology. Modern neuroscience confirms that peak experiences can literally be installed in human consciousness through the right combination of story, symbol, and shared practice. Dr. Rick Hanson's research on taking in the good shows that when we fully absorb positive experiences, they create lasting changes in brain structure. The bread miracle created the world's first consciousness installation program. The fragments were the hardware, The story was the software, and breaking bread together was the user interface that allowed people to run the program in their own lives. 2,000 years later, billions of people still download this experience every time they share a meal and remember this story. They're not just commemorating an ancient event, they're activating an ancient technology for transforming human consciousness from scarcity to abundance, from fear to generosity, from individual survival to collective thriving. The 12 baskets prove that the deepest human experiences don't just happen and disappear, they can be preserved, transmitted and regenerated across generations through the right combination of story, symbol and practice. These 3 psychological secrets reveal that the bread miracle wasn't just about food, it was about unlocking human potential that most people never access. Collective flow states that transform crowds, paradoxical leadership that multiplies capacity, memory technology that spreads consciousness across civilizations. If these 3 cases exploded your mind, smash the like button and subscribe to not miss our next mysteries. And tell us in the comments, which of these revelations surprised you most? Hit the bell so the algorithm doesn't lie to you. And if you know someone who needs to see this, share it. Because these truths need to be known. Until next time, keep questioning everything you think you know about human potential. This analysis is speculative and explores psychological and social dynamics based on historical accounts. It is not intended as theological interpretation or clinical diagnosis.